Hi, my name is Dr. Jan Davidson from the Cape Fear Museum, and I'm here today to talk to you about Wilmington's history, learning lessons from the past. There's been a lot of talk about history and memorialization and what the past means in the last few years. As we've been going through a time that we know will be in the history books, it seems like a good time to think about what history can teach us. Today, I'm going to explore some of the transformative moments in our county and city's history and ask you to think about how the history you carry within you affects you, and to consider how knowing about the beautiful, terrible history of this country may help us be better public servants. So when I say the history we carry within us, I don't just mean individually, but institutionally as well. Many organizations, institutions, and groups in the county and city have challenging histories. For example, the Cape Fear Museum was founded by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. It was designed to valorize that Confederacy. And we were first housed in the Wilmington Light Infantry Building, then in the courthouse, then in the police station, and then, as we are today, in the 1930s WP Armory. We have been cheek to jowl with the courts and the police, housed in places representing state power. And these have historically been sites of inequity for African Americans in the region. We literally have bars on the windows of the historic parts of our building. You scratch the surface of pretty much any organization with a history here, and there will be strands of the story that are shaped by the inequities of the past. For example, we had two hospitals, James Walker Memorial and Community Hospital. They were segregated, and we had segregated medical care through most of the first part of the 20th century. So what I'm trying to suggest is that pretending our history is not hard and hurtful does not help us better serve our community. While we cannot change the past, we certainly can learn some lessons from it. History also teaches us negative lessons about things we shouldn't do, but it also teaches us positive lessons. Just as Cape Fear Museum is a site of historic inequity, we are also a site of possibility. One of our largest artifact donations in recent years came from an African-American family who wanted to honor their family's contributions to the region. We are a place where people come together and do discuss tough issues, including segregation and racial violence. When we do African-American related programs or when we work with the schools, our audiences are much more racially diverse than the county is. We don't transcend our past. Our history makes some of our community more ambivalent about what we are, who we represent, and what stories we tell. We need to understand and respect people's feelings and histories with us, even if we weren't there when that history happened. And that's the same for any institution in our region. So let's explore the history of this place that we call home. New Hanover County was founded in 1729, and when it was founded, it was a much larger geographic area. And these are just a few of the counties that have been formed out of that land mass that was New Hanover when it first was founded more than 3 centuries ago, or nearly 3 centuries ago. This is the first map of Wilmington. As you can see, it's just 4 blocks on the Cape Fear River. The city was founded in the 18th century, and although it was small, it was mighty. It became the hub of the region. New Hanover County was home to a large naval stores industry. It was the largest city in North Carolina by the 1830s. It was the northern edge of the Rice Belt. So it was a land of great productivity, and Wilmington was the hub of those commercial endeavors. Slavery was critical to these economic endeavors. This graph on the left shows the percentage of enslaved persons as residents of New Hanover County, and then in comparison with the state. So New Hanover County is the blue. And as you can see, for much of the 19th century, over half of our residents were enslaved people. Even in the later part of the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, it's nearly half. So this is a much higher rate of enslavement than North Carolina as a whole. And it means that slavery was incredibly important and embedded in our society. At the same time, over the course of the 19th century, the city grew and the population of the county grew as well. In 1860, my research shows 45% of free residents of New Hanover County lived in households that directly benefited from slave labor. Slavery was in the forest and on the farm, and it was a much more varied experience in our county than it would have been in just a plantation economy. Enslavers were men, women, children. There were corporate enslavers. They were farmers, merchants, widows, physicians, lawyers, ministers, railroad executives, barkeepers, and even the captain of a steamer. As I just said, slavery was embedded in the county's fabric. Of course, after the Civil War, which was fought in places like Fort Fisher and was such an important part of American history, emancipation changes the relationships of people who live in our region. Under slavery, you couldn't legally learn to read or write if you were an enslaved person. You couldn't get married, you couldn't control your family, and you couldn't even control where you lived. So after the end of slavery, after emancipation, people wanted to find and live with their families, to learn how to read and write, and to take advantage of the new opportunities that freedom provided. Just as before the Civil War, after the Civil War, African Americans made up the majority of our county and city population in through the rest of the 19th century. This Black majority meant that New Hanover County was a place of relative opportunity for African Americans. Previously enslaved people who had learned skills under slavery took those skills and transformed them into entrepreneurial opportunities. So there was a rising number of African American owned businesses like Hargrave and Son, which is a 3-generation blacksmithing business on the north side of town. Alfred Hargrave, the founder, had been an enslaved craftsperson, and he became a business owner. There were also new educational opportunities that many people took advantage of. And it wasn't just kids who went to school, adults flocked to the schoolhouse door as well. In Wilmington in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, you saw these these educated African Americans joining professions and becoming professional folks who helped and served in our community. It's not surprising, given Wilmington's size and the largeness of the African-American population, that both the first Black male doctor and the first Black female doctor in North Carolina both practiced in Wilmington. Dr. James Schober practiced in the 1870s, Dr. Lucy Hughes in the 1890s. We also had folks like Mary Washington Howe, who was a member of the Howe family who'd lived here in the antebellum period. She was a free woman of color who went to the north, to Philadelphia, to get educated, and then came back here, was a school teacher, and was the principal of Williston School during the 1890s. We also saw African-American men gain the right to vote, and again, because African Americans were in the majority, that meant that Black men had a voice in government and voice in political power that they had not had before the Civil War. So we had Black men who served as our legislators in the state and also as our representatives in the county and on the city level of city government. So this was a place that was had been transformed by emancipation, spreading opportunity to a much wider group of folks in the county. Not everything in history goes in a trajectory of progress, and we can see some signs in the 1870s that this multiracial government may not last. One of those signs is that Pender County was formed out of New Hanover County on the direction of the General Assembly, which was full of white supremacist Democrats. And that happened in 1875. Pender was the top 2/3 of New Hanover County before that, and it was turned into its own county, designed to lower the political power of New Hanover County and the city of Wilmington. So by the 1890s, in the generation after slavery, these relatively good economic and political prospects for African Americans and the size and the importance of the city helped make Wilmington this place of possibility that I just described. It also made Wilmington the site of a white supremacy campaign. In 1897, North Carolina's Democratic Party decided to embark on a white supremacy campaign to drive populists and Republican politicians out of office during the 1898 election. The campaign used speeches, propaganda cartoons, the threat of violence, and actual violence to create support for white supremacy. On November 8, 1898, New Hanover County's Democrats used threats and intimidation to stop African Americans from voting. Pro-Democratic Party election officers tampered with the returns, and because of these tactics, Democrats swept the election. On November 10, 1898, 2 days after the contested election, a mob of armed white men marched to the office of the Daily Record, which you can see on fire in this image, which was the local African-American newspaper, and set it on fire. After burning the Daily Record offices, a violent mob then took to the streets and on the north side of town attacked African Americans. An unknown number of people died. An unknowable number of people died. Others, white and black, were banished from the city, and on the same day, locally elected city officials were forced to resign and were replaced by white supremacist leaders. Once generally referred to as a riot, these events are now more widely understood to have been a white supremacist massacre and a coup d'etat. As a part of that, those events, a White Declaration of Independence was written, and one of the lines in it is on the screen now, and it is one of the things that shapes the future of New Hanover County and Wilmington after 1898, where the city, folks in the city and county, more than 450 men signed this, declared that they would no longer be ruled or never again be ruled by men of African origin. They were seeking to make a permanent revolution that would deny African Americans in our community political, social, and economic rights. So we talk about this event, one, because it's really important that the people who live here know about this past, but also because it has such a ripple effect on the history of our region and our state in the 20th century. The white supremacy campaign was not a single campaign against Wilmington. It was a statewide effort, and it was a statewide effort that culminated in 1900 with the passage of what's referred to in the paper that's on your screen as a white supremacy amendment, but was a suffrage amendment that essentially denied Black men the right to vote. And this has a chilling effect on democracy in our state through much of the 20th century. After 1898, increasing numbers of Jim Crow laws were passed that led to legally sanctioned race-based segregation. There were laws beforehand. The schools had been segregated in 1875, but after 1898, rail and steamboat travel was segregated, streetcars were segregated, so were buses, the prisons, the state library. So at the same time as we see this rise in Jim Crow, the city of Wilmington underwent dramatic growth and change. So for over 60 years, as the population grows, it does so under the tenets of Jim Crow. And this shows a map of the annexation history of the city, which gives you a sense of how the city spreads across the county's width, if you want to call it that, during the 20th century. So for at least up through the 60s and 70s, maybe even a little longer, you see the effects of the segregation of the past on how these areas are developed. In places that are new, like our beach towns, we don't see racial segregation, we see racial exclusion. New towns like Carolina Beach and Wrightsville Beach did not allow African Americans to buy property there. In return, or in response, places like Ocean City Beach, which was a Black beach resort off Topsail, were formed, but we definitely see these bifurcated places. And there were also the growth as the city grew of new whites-only suburbs that developed around the city of Wilmington using racially restrictive covenants. These were literally words written into the deeds of our houses. For example, a 1926 deed from Creasy Street, which is a street in Carolina Place, said that the house should be not be, quote, sold, rented, or otherwise disposed of to persons of African descent. So we see the spread of housing and the spread of suburban neighborhoods in our region at the same time as we see these restrictions being put in place. And this is a close-up of that map, which is from 1939, that shows the area above 17th Street around Wrightsville Avenue, which is Carolina Place, which is 100% white, in part because of these deeds that are, these restrictions that are written into the deeds. Racially restrictive covenants were legal until 1948. I mean, legal until 1968, although they were declared unenforceable after 1948, but they helped create physical racial segregation, house by house, neighborhood by neighborhood. And they're still having an effect even as the population of the city and the county are rising and the population of folks who live outside of the city limits proper is growing as well. These are just a few examples of those covenants that were put in place. All of these neighborhoods are off Oleander Drive, and you can see they all have this language built into them. There are even some racial restrictions that go the other way, although there are much fewer African-American only neighborhoods. This one is a small one that was off Eastwood. While these restrictive covenants were unenforceable, as I said, after 1948, they continue to have a chilling effect on our population's distribution by race. This is a neighborhood analysis done by you all, by the city in the late 1960s, and a whole host of the suburbs that ring the core city are 100% white at this point. We also see in this neighborhood analysis the effects on the neighborhoods that were left behind. So on the left is predominantly African-American neighborhoods are called out in the gray. And then on the right, you can see the housing stock that is in bad condition in our city, and those areas are very much connected. And in part that is because programs of the Public Housing Administration, the Urban Renewal Administration, and the Federal Housing Authority all accepted and codified white racial prejudices and helped maintain this segregation. And at the same time, African Americans had less access to things like mortgages, and it was harder to get a mortgage at that time to fix up an old home than to buy a new home. So there were lots and lots of ways in which African Americans, regardless of the income that they made, were held into existing old traditional African American neighborhoods. Some of these barriers fall, but even up through 2010, you can still see the effects of that history on our cities, on where people live in the city. This is a map from 2010 using the census. And the purple areas are areas that are 75% non-white in a region that at that point was 20% African-American or people of color. And if you look, that purple area is still very similar to that 1960s neighborhood analysis maps, which were in turn similar to that 1930s WPA map. This, to me at least, suggests the powerful legacy of housing segregation in our community. Nonetheless, the history does change, things open up. We see in the late 1960s and early 1970s, schools and other public spaces are desegregated by court order. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about schools as an example of how our community changes. In the 1950s, despite the passage of Brown v. Board of Education, which said that you should desegregate the schools, North Carolina and New Hanover County resisted those moves. Our school superintendent at the time, Herrick M. Rowland, was very much against integration, and the school board was basically all white. And so they maintained the idea that having segregated schools was still something that this community wanted. In the 1960s, we see the state change to a freedom of choice plan. So as a parent, you could try and get your kid into a closer school, regardless of what racial designation that school was, but it was still up to the school board about whether that would happen or not. And so we see as the civil rights movement grows and it becomes more active, both in the nation and in our region, we see folks like Dr. Hubert Eaton challenge those laws, and Eaton, along with some other parents, took out a lawsuit against New Hanover County Board of Education in 1964, which helped transform our school system. On the national level, the Civil Rights Act meant that you could not receive federal financial assistance if you discriminated. And in 1968, or by 1968, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare says if you have a dual structure of schools, i.e. racially segregated schools, you can no longer get federal funding. So things could not stay the same. And at the end of the school year in 1968, in June, after the school is out, the school board votes to close Williston Senior High School, a source of pride for the African-American community, beginning in 1968, and then send those students to New Hanover and the newly opened Hoggard High School. This was the first big step in our community towards desegregation, and was ironically an attempt to avoid desegregating the schools at all levels. The board hoped that if they desegregated the high schools, they wouldn't necessarily have to do all the elementary schools. From 1968 through the fall of 1971, it was a time of great uncertainty and challenges in the schools in our communities. And the incidents that led to the Wilmington 10 case happened after Williston was closed, but before the entire school system was desegregated. So all the tensions and focus was on the high school level. In February 1971, during an African-American student-led boycott of the high schools, violence erupted. A police officer shot and killed a Black teenager. A 57-year-old white man was also fatally shot, and at least 3 people were wounded, including a police officer and a minister. Over the course of a very tense few days, numerous fires were set around the city. Almost a year later, 10 people, Reginald Epps, Jerry Jacobs, James McCoy, Wayne Moore, Willie Earl Vereen, William Joe Wright II, Connie Tyndall, Marvin Patrick, Ann Shepard, and Benjamin Chavez were charged and then tried and convicted on a series of felony charges. The 10 were sentenced to a combined total of more than 280 years in jail. The case against the Wilmington 10 actually began to crumble quickly, and in January 1978, Governor James Hunt reduced the Wilmington 10 sentences, but they weren't exonerated. It wasn't until 2010 that the 10 2012 that the 10 were bombed. So this was all happening over the time the schools were desegregating. Hindsight shows that desegregation was inevitable. The courts and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was not going to stand for more of the same. But even right before school was scheduled to open in 1971, the school board decided to appeal, and the county provided $10,000 to fund their suit. And at that time, the statement of the school board said, your school board has resisted this plan, i.e. the plan to desegregate schools, in every way possible. We saw lots of protest, mostly by white members of the community, in the aftermath of the opening of the schools in the 1971-1972 school year. And white supremacists, again, seemed emboldened in our community to act. Groups like the Rights of White People grew up in response to the school situation in 1971, but violence was not confined to 1971, and it was not confined to the schools. In 1973, a synagogue, an apartment building, a Jewish-owned store, and the Wilmington Journal, our Black-owned newspaper, were all bombed. Lawrence Little, pictured here in a court drawing, was aged 18 and sentenced to life imprisonment for the bombing of the Wilmington Journal's office. His conviction wasn't the end of the matter. As the case against the Wilmington 10 crumbled, the Ku Klux Klan tried to get Little released, calling him the Wilmington 1. They were unsuccessful, and Little died in prison in 1989. Even as we saw all this tension and challenges within our community over the schools, it's also a time of changing possibilities. Just like after emancipation in the 19th century, changes in legal status for African Americans especially, but also for women, opened doors and provided space, new space for people to capitalize on their talents and make change. In these three pictures, you see Edward Haynes on the left, who was one of the first 2 Black men to be a police officer since 1898. He was hired in 1954 and became a lieutenant. In the middle is Joseph McNeil, a Williston graduate who graduated in 1959. He was one of the Greensboro 4, who helped start the civil rights sit-in movement. He went on to work for the FAA and was in the Air Force and retired with the rank of Major General. And 3rd Street was renamed for him a couple of years ago. On the right, you see Maxine Brown, a 1970 graduate of John T. Hoggard, a school named after the man who was the chair of the Board of Education in 1954, and thus one of the people responsible for the county's decision to resist Brown v. Board of Education. Nonetheless, Brown, who is an early, obviously, graduate of the now integrated John T. Hoggard School, went on to UNC Chapel Hill to work at Procter & Gamble and to become their chief diversity officer. Her life is almost unimaginable for a Black woman in the 19th century. And yet we see so many of our members of our community making great strides and helping improve our city and our county. In the 20th century, we see the rebirth of the Black press with the Gervais family's Cape Fear Journal that became the Wilmington Journal after World War II when T.C. Gervais was at the helm and is still our African-American newspaper. And we see in 1972, after more than 70 years without a Black City Council member, Kenneth J. McLaurin was appointed to the Wilmington City Council. And since that time, we have seen a number of African Americans being elected again to local government office. We see Catherine Moore, who was the first Black woman to be on the city council, and that was in the 90s. You see Jonathan Joe Barfield, who's Commissioner Barfield Sr., who was the first Black man to be a commissioner again, and he was elected in 1980. These Black candidates face an uphill battle. The proportion of the African Americans in the county's population has fallen. And so that, combined with the fact that we have county-wide offices, means that African American candidates need white support. But nonetheless, we see a rise in numbers of African Americans in our county government and our city government. While structural racism continues to place limits on our community, history suggests that there are always barriers and possibilities woven into the varied experiences of the people who call New Hanover County home. In many ways, our history suggests that if we can't learn to carry the past differently and acknowledge its deep place in our lives, we'll always struggle to come to terms with the issues that have haunted and shaped our county and country and city for centuries. And at the same time, there are always examples of people who are difference makers. So as you continue to serve the public through your roles with the city, I'd like to encourage you to shape the future by understanding the ways that history is present in every day. It's all around us in the shape of our streets, in the neighborhoods we live in the organizations we work for, and in the social structures that shape our daily lives. So that's my presentation. There's a lot more to the history than the history I've just told you. If you want to learn more, you should visit the museum. And if you have any questions that I could help you with or suggestions that you'd like to share with us, my email is on the screen right in front of you. Thank you.